Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SITREP. SITREP is a notorious open source intelligent app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SITREP, for sponsoring this episode. Welcome to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias.
I'm Michael. I'm a senior intel analyst at Artorias.
And I'm Mike. I'm an intel analyst at Artorias as well.
And in this episode, we are going to be discussing two main geopolitical events just in the previous episode we did. Previous episode, if our listeners recall, we talked about the situation in Venezuela and Iran. And in this episode, we're going to talk about the latest breaking news impacting the situation in Greenland and in Syria. If you listen to our spaces on X, formerly known as Twitter, this is a topic that we've had regular conversations about, and we wanted to bring it up to speed and give you guys our analysis and our perspective on the latest situations both in Greenland and in Syria. And so as of this recording, we have actually very major developments related to the situation in Greenland. And that is President Trump, on a Truth Social post, after meeting the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, indicated that they now have a framework of an agreement. And subsequent reporting from the New York Times and other Western press and U.S. press indicates that this agreement basically is going to involve various aspects. Number one, the purchase of small parcels of land in Greenland for the establishment of U.S. military bases in the island. Number two, an undefined way, but basically access to Greenland's minerals and mineral rights for the United States. Number three, and this is very interesting, they basically singled out Russia and China to ensure that Russian and Chinese influence will be reduced or even non-existent in Greenland. For the establishment of the U.S. missile defense system called the Golden Dome to protect the United States homeland. Clearly, if history, as anybody's using history as a guide, similar to the Star Wars project under the Reagan administration, now called the Golden Dome, and that will be established in Greenland. And then five, the expansion of investment opportunities for U.S. company inside of Greenland. And this agreement, after President Trump met with the Secretary General of NATO at the sidelines of the Davos summit, followed increased amount of tension between the United States, Denmark, Greenland, and our European allies, where Trump threatened to even utilize military force to seize Greenland, and then announced that he was going to impose tariffs on specific European countries who have deployed military personnel to Greenland as part of a NATO exercise to reinforce security in NATO. Those tariffs have now been suspended. Trump also announced that on his Truth Social, and it looks like cooler heads have prevailed. Obviously, the devil's in the details, and more negotiations are going to continue. President Trump already announced that this negotiation will continue to be led by Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. So I guess we'll see where the negotiations continue. But it does look like NATO will have a much more significant presence in the Arctic, and the United States will refocus on Greenland and deploy additional assets to Greenland to levels probably not seen since the Cold War. But to start this conversation, let me go to Michael. Michael, first, your overall assessment on this whole Greenland situation. It does look like the actual purchase or invasion of Greenland completely is out of the table. It looks like it's just going to really be limited to much more military presence inside of Greenland. But is this a situation where cooler heads prevails and we can move on to the next geopolitical crisis? Or do you think this might have lasting damage and trust between the United States and our European allies within the construct of the NATO alliance?
Thanks, Stefano. I just got to say, this entire situation was just in no way cooler heads prevailing. It was simply talking down, the worst case scenario with the NATO alliance. We have seen this entire basically week and a half, about maybe even about the past month, ever since Trump really started talking about it, just put so much stress on like not only this alliance, but just the European and American, relationship as a whole. We are seeing lasting damage. I no doubt about it. Everything that Trump wanted out of Greenland, he could have gotten just by asking. There was nothing probably anything that was preventing him from just achieving the goals that he's probably seeking right now. And whatever those goals really are, we're still kind of in the dark about. Like, what were his full final goals with Greenland? Just either be like security, trade. I mean, it could have been a mixture of things, but really everything he could have gotten out of this deal, he could have gotten just by asking, just negotiating with the Danish, with the European Union as a whole. And all he got now was strained relationships with everybody in Europe, because this is shown, and I think we really saw the pushback from several European leaders regarding this whole situation just shows that Europe is really kind of now realizing that, appeasement of Trump is not going to achieve the kind of goals that they want, achieve a stable relationship with him. Um, question kind of remains now, is a stable relationship with Trump, possible? Is his administration one that they want to continue working with? And that's no position you want to be with, an entire continent that has been our allies for well over 50 years. And now that that relationship's harmed, it's going to take a lot to really repair it.
So, Mike, same question to you. Is this a situation where you believe it's much more lasting damage? And is there really anything within the framework of the deal that Trump got that he didn't necessarily need to go and threaten invasion that he wouldn't have got if this was done, behind closed doors and in much more cooler way of negotiation?
Yeah, I'll start with this. I think this was a little bit of the art of the deal type situation with the president, right? I think he had seen an opportunity to really push, a strong line from the United States when it came to Greenland. I think he was looking for a little more than he got, but the midterms are coming, and I think again, I think the whole situation surrounding Greenland and some of the talking points that were coming out from the White House just weren't sticking with some of the domestic audience in the United States. It came off as a little bit unnecessary, a little bit unclear. I think it is intended to be that America first policy, right? Focus on the Western Hemisphere, trying to frame it as, this is for our national security, protection of the country. But, it just came off a little bit convoluted. I think they also were looking for a quick foreign policy win. We saw what happened in Venezuela, the successful operation there to remove Maduro. I think the administration thought they were going to be able to kind of bully NATO a little bit more, and including Denmark specifically, and it just didn't come out as planned. So I think the administration will try to claim this as a victory, say, hey, you said that like cool ahead prevailed, right? That the NATO and Denmark saw where we were coming from and accepted it, right? That they needed to give us our place there and let us protect let us protect the United States, Arctic, put in the Golden Dome, do what we need to do there in order to guarantee security from the Russian and Chinese threat. And I think maybe the plan now is to let Greenland kind of fade into the background because it just didn't stick as they thought it would.
I mean, I guess one of the aspects that I was kind of, you know, where I'm kind of analyzing the situation is I find it very interesting that from a mineral perspective, right? I think everybody is framing this idea that somehow this is a huge win and now the US gets mineral rights. And I kind of want our listeners to understand something that I think is very fundamental, right? I mean, Denmark and specifically Greenland have been begging US companies to invest in US minerals for over a decade inside of Greenland. And the problem is it's not as easy as it sounds. It's a very difficult process. Permafrost is a huge issue. It's very expensive. It's like the oil sector within Venezuela. President Trump can go on and say, "We're going to get the oil. We're going to get the oil." That was going to take over it's going to take maybe even up to a decade for the oil industry inside of Venezuela to get out of this crisis that it dug itself in from the Chavez and Maduro regime. And if you look at Greenland with the minerals, it's the same contract. It's not just easy. The problem in Greenland was not somehow this idea that Denmark and Greenland weren't willing to open up their minerals to the United States. It was private U.S. companies just weren't interested because of the cost. And so now we have this framework of an agreement. And, Greenland and Denmark are going to look at U.S. companies, and unless we force them, which we can't, U.S. companies to do this, we might run into the same situation. But I think that's one of the main issues. I mean, number two, it does look like the framework of the agreement that President Trump announced basically mirrors the 1951 Greenland-U.S. Defense Treaty, right, where the United States commits itself to the defense. I think one of the fundamental differences, though, was that under the 1951 agreement, it kind of says lease was the term they used. This one is purchased. And so I guess the idea, I mean, there could be an issue with sovereignty claims in that. Obviously, apparently in Danish laws, if there's anything related to sovereignty in a treaty ratification that might reduce or relinquish the sovereignty of Denmark per the Danish constitution, it would require 5/6 either the vote in a national referendum in the parliament. It would be interesting if they might find out ways to kind of wiggle their way out of that. And maybe it's like a lease in a much more broader term and how they do this. The other aspect is they kind of frame this as indefinite. But when I'm looking at the deals, I mean, there's just nothing here that Denmark and Greenland never would have agreed upon with the United States if this was done behind the scenes. That's what I think is infuriating. The outright acquisition of Greenland seemed ridiculous. It seemed absurd. I think it has done very significant damage. And out of all the European allies to kind of pick a fight, it's kind of, shocking that the one country they decided to go after was Denmark, a huge, reliable ally, not only in NATO, but to the United States specifically, both from a military dimension of deploying military personnel to Afghanistan and Iraq during the global war on terror, but also from their intelligence agencies, right? I mean, if anybody who's kind of have experience within the intelligence sector would know Denmark is a very reliable ally to the United States with excellent insight. The Danish intelligence agencies are, very professional organizations who have done amazing work specifically related to the situation in Russia. And we do know of open source reporting and reporting from the press of indicating the United States has been able to gain access to a lot of information inside of Russia, even specifically Russian military units called the GRU, because of the involvement of Danish intelligence agencies, right? And it's kind of like now Denmark was in a situation where they viewed the United States as a rival, as a threat akin to Russia. And I think that's just one of the areas where kind of everybody's scratching their head of why. I mean, this was a crisis that maybe lasted a week to 2 weeks, really boiled over in a couple of days, and has been quickly set aside and moved on. And the concern, obviously, is this going to have lasting damage into the transatlantic relationship? I am concerned about that. I do believe it's damaged, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of things that can be repaired. I mean, we've seen moments of tensions between the United States and Europe and a large variety of issues that kind of get fixed over time. And I do believe time is a good way of healing aspects and issues that goes on. And I think this is something where even the Trump administration realized, and to be honest, I think the main reason why President Trump backed down was because of the economy. In the sense, more specifically, not only just the stock markets, but the treasury yields were battering the markets. They were not doing well. People rushed to gold. They viewed a trade war between the United States and the European Union as very credible. And that's why we saw gold skyrocketed, because there was a lack of confidence in the euro and the dollar and U.S. treasuries. People flocked to the gold. And once the agreement was announced by Truth Social, you saw gold plummet in value, going back to kind of the pre-crisis level, indicating that, I think the economy was the main reason that this has kind of calmed down. And I think it's also important to note that one of the key figures, I think, in the second Trump administration is going to be the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. I mean, this isn't the first time that he has been able to kind of be Trump whisperer in a way. He has been very successful in inserting himself in any diplomatic tensions between the United States and Europe. Before, we saw him very much involved in Ukraine and Russia, and pushed Trump to be kind of much more a pro-Ukrainian route than a pro-Russian route, and kind of solidifying that. And now we see that here within the construct of Greenland. I do believe there's going to be a deal. It's going to take time to negotiate, but I think it's just going to go back to increased U.S. military presence, similar to what we saw in the Cold War, was just a golden dome in the missile defense, and maybe some more economic opportunities that was always going to happen. But I think Mark Rutte is going to be a key figure that people are going to analyze throughout history as being, a key stabilizing force in the transatlantic alliance, and playing a very different role within NATO as the Secretary General, of trying to be that middle person and talking to Trump, appeasing Trump, listening to Trump, and making sure that the best outcome for NATO goes through with this. But Mike, I'll pass it on to you.
Yeah, Stefano, thanks. I would address three of your points. The first one's on the economy. Yeah, I think that's pretty telling about what the situation was, right? The economy domestically, midterms coming up. I think one of the most telling things were, I think CNN reported this about the chief of staff on Air Force One, came back to the reporter pool and told them, hey, listen, there's going to be a lot less international trips It's going to be much more like I think they had, like Iowa, they had like a few domestic trips coming up that she highlighted for them. That was pretty interesting to see that the chief staff went out of her way to tell them that. The second point, I wanted to mention on there was the NATO Secretary General, and you bring up some really interesting points, and really, I think you're super effective on that because watching that live, especially when he brought up the points about NATO support the United States, 9/11 and in Afghanistan, it was just very polished, very professional, right? He didn't go out to tease Trump or to like bring shame on him, right? He just stated his points very clearly. And I think people had been talking about for a long time. He came off extremely polished, confident, just it was just really impressive to watch. And it was an emotional argument, but a very clear argument. I think he does become one of those main characters that the administration might look to as a respected figure. During Davos, president went after a few people and had some little bit of teasing moments, right, with Macron and stuff. But it was just very interesting to see the NATO Secretary General's interaction with them. And the third point is, I think the president has his way of doing things, right? I think he goes out there and likes to break things and say what he wants and, telling it like it is and talk tough. But I think there are some interesting individuals in the administration who are going to be maybe not forced, but encouraged to pick up the pieces and mend some of those fences in the background. I think one of them is going to be Secretary of State Marco Rubio. It'll be interesting to see kind of what he does with the Europeans and see how we could kind of put a band-aid on some of this and say, hey, listen, some of this is just public persona behind the scenes. Like we both got what we want here, and we can kind of just let this go and go back to supporting, NATO and what the goal should be there.
I'm going to go back to this idea when we're talking about Greenland. I think I said this in the space where I think and I don't know why. I have my ideas of President Trump, why he has a focus on Greenland, but people I think are putting too much importance in Greenland from either a geopolitical or even a U.S. homeland defense or national security perspective, right? I mean, look, does it have importance? Absolutely. Like no disagreement there. But is this idea that Greenland is somehow vital for vital for American national security? No, it's not. It really isn't. And we can have arguments one way or another. And the ways that you can kind of have that conversation is very niche and focused that puts it in the perspective of a second or even third tier level of importance for the United States. And in no way, shape, or form can we look at Greenland as this vital national security interest in the United States. Much more, Panama Canal is clearly much more important, not only to the economic interest of the United States, but the national security interest of the United States, right? Like that is something that is much more vital to the United States than Greenland. And I think for some reason, people are putting too much emphasis there. And even let's talk about the threat that Greenland faces from, let's say, Russia or China, right? Okay, from an economic perspective, obviously China, especially if the United States or Europe is not going to kind of have increased investments inside of Greenland, could you run into a situation where Chinese economic interests kind of take a hold into Greenland? Yes, but we've seen this before, and that doesn't necessarily translate into a significant national security threat per se for the United States, right? I mean, there is a concern. There's always going to be a concern, but I mean, Chinese investments in the United States dwarf anything that they're going to do in Greenland, and we're not. Although there's congressional hearings and people are raising the alarm about it or maybe trying to raise their voice and say, hey, we should be monitoring this, it's nowhere near, Greenland is nowhere near what the Chinese invest in the United States, right? So to kind of single out Greenland when in our own backyard is significantly worse, I think it's a little bit hypocritical, right? And then from a military perspective, this isn't risk. You can't just roll the dice and move forces into Greenland. This is not, from a military dimension, it would be an absolute nightmare for any military force to do this. And if you're analyzing it from a geopolitical rivals of the United States, there's only one, you can maybe make the argument that Russia, but the problem with Russia is they've been so wholeheartedly consumed by Ukraine and their expeditionary force has been absolutely destroyed and gutted that they don't have either the airlift and let alone the naval lift capability to do anything in Greenland. And so even from a military perspective, is not realistic. And China obviously is not going to travel halfway around the world to focus on Greenland when they're prioritizing Taiwan. And so what everybody kind of goes out to is this northern route perspective, right? And which is an interesting dynamic. And look, I graduated from the Merchant Marine Academy, Legion Maritime. Actually, one of my college papers, ironically, was about the Arctic way back in 2009, about the northern passages of the maritime route and all that. It's getting way overblown in importance. In no universe is the northern route through the polar ever going to rival any major transatlantic or transpacific maritime routes that exist today. This is never going to happen. The market is never going to be there. The capabilities are never going to be there. And the time of year to do that is very limited and still has a lot of risk associated with it from an environmental perspective and a safety perspective that I think is going to be a huge constraint for a lot of countries. You can maybe analyze it from a natural resource, but you're also running into the same issue. It's great to look at oil and discover oil in the northern, Arctic, but how much money would it take to get it out? And what's the break even point, let alone the profit margins necessary to actually establish those types of things? And I think this is the problem with the Arctic, where we're putting too much emphasis and focus from an economic perspective there, and then that kind of gets morphed into this military geopolitical component that is just vastly overestimating the importance of Greenland and the Northern Atlantic. Look, Alaska plays a vital role for the United States in many aspects from a national security and economic perspective, but we've been established ourselves in Alaska for a very, very, very long time. And the roles that it plays has been very well established. A lot of these areas that we are talking about in the Arctic and specifically in Greenland are not conducive for that. And there has been attempts to do that from an economic front, and there's issues, and there's going to be continue to be issues. But I think we need to put the Arctic within the larger construct of the globe. And when we analyze other hotspots, other geopolitical priorities for the United States or for the West, Greenland should not be in the top five. And for NATO to expand their military presence in Greenland, although it's commendable, I'm a little bit concerned that there is a construct of limited resources and finite resources. And if you're going to deploy it in Greenland, are you sacrificing somewhere else? And where are we sacrificing? Is it the Baltics? Is it Eastern Europe? Is it in Africa? Is it in the Middle East, where we have vital also interest specifically in the counterterrorism perspective? And I think that's kind of the concern that I have. And I think we need to put the construct of the Arctic in a much more realistic conversation that I think is getting completely overblown and ignored. But Michael, go ahead.
Well, I completely agree. Honestly, let's start from the beginning here. The three major points that you kind of put on right there is that like the geopolitical, the economic, and the military positioning that Greenland gives. Like in the geopolitical sense, there's nothing to worry about for the United States. Like Greenland is a territory that's owned by one of our strongest and one of our most cooperative allies. It's also the North Sea Passage is mainly also controlled and surrounded by U.S. allies in Canada and the United States itself with Alaska. We already have a heavy advantage when it comes to the area, and when it comes in terms of Russia, well, we can speculate what their power prediction may be within like the century. Well, that's honestly the discussion you have to have when it comes to Greenland. You have to think like a century ahead because that's really the only benefits it's going to pull forward, especially economic and militarily as well. In the economic sense, most of the resources there are more expensive to extract and get out than they are utilizing, and it's not going to be really useful until well into the future. And when it comes into the military aspect, I absolutely agree. Like there is some strategic arguing you could have about like Greenland's position and it being strategic, especially in terms if you just focus in on Russia. China's come almost completely out of the question. I mean, if you even consider like the economic question, what like the North Sea Passage is going to be easier to get more goods from Asia into the United States, into the Atlantic, and is that really something that the United States is striving for to get Chinese goods into the EU and into the United States easier? That seems like kind of the opposite of what the Trump admin is actually like, putting forward as well, and what they're actively striving for with the economy. I I really think that like the only way you could argue and the only way you can really think about Greenland is like decades ahead. And right now, like we have to weigh out like whatever benefit Greenland has is not worth what we are sacrificing in the short term or potentially in the long term with our relationship to Europe, who, in my opinion, is a much stronger and something we need to focus on much more, especially with the EU, trying to take this hand of being more independent from the United States. Like, I mean, the argument can be made whether or not that's good, whether that's bad for U.S. interests, whatever. But that is the direction we see Europe going in. That's the direction we even see NATO somewhat going in with their and how the United States is going to play into that in the next couple of years or coming into the next decade is something we really need to consider. And Greenland is not part of that question. Greenland should not be considered part of that question. And whether or not the Trump admin is going to care about that is concerning because it affects one of our longest relationships and our influence within Europe.
I'm wondering if, again, this has to be analyzed, this whole debacle, right? It should be analyzed from a long-term or short-term implication, right? Because again, I'm going to go back to the Panama Canal. Like, I mean, if when we're analyzing from the U.S., like let's say media market, right? The Panama Canal had a lot of conversation, and because it was also the beginning of the second Trump administration, it didn't really put that much importance. But it was Panama. They weren't a major, they weren't an ally of ours per se. They weren't part of NATO. Nothing of that nature, right? But inside of Panama, I mean, this caused a major political problem set for Panama. It was a huge problem. And the irony of the situation, if you're analyzing it in Panama, is that there was actually much more Chinese, let's say, involvement within the Panamanian Canal, right? That there was much more economic interest there that, I mean, not there yet, but you can maybe make the argument that down the road can even have a military component. Again, I think we need to be realistic about Chinese extreme limitations in expeditionary naval warfare capabilities and their ability to project power. And I think a lot of times we try to analyze China and the US from a numbers game, but same capabilities, and that's not reality. But you can make the argument of saying, okay, down the road, because China has this economic interest and involvement and investments inside of Panama, down the road, we can see something like Sri Lanka, where they now establish a major naval base, maybe 5, 10 years, 15 years in the future, that is a direct threat to the United States because they can choke off the Panama Canal, right? And that conversation inside of Panama, when President Trump threatened to seize the Panama Canal, was a huge political crisis inside of Panama. But it was quickly resolved and a deal was made. And we saw the Panamanians kick out Chinese investment firms, open up the United States. And then from there, we saw increased military training between the United States and Panama to ensure, okay, hey, the United States will continue to be the primary security partner in the Panama Canal, right? And that kind of just moved on. Nobody has really talked about that again. We haven't seen any conversations inside of Panama about it. We haven't seen any conversations in the United States about it. It has been completely forgotten. And I'm wondering if that's what's going to happen within this construct of Greenland, if that's kind of the next step. Or is Greenland, I think as you guys were alluding to, just one of the multitude of crises that we have between the Trump administration and Europe, where you can talk Greenland within the construct of Russia, Ukraine, and how Trump has been a little bit more favorable to Vladimir Putin compared to President Zelensky. Is this also within the national defense strategy with this kind of weird aspect of civilizational decline? And in Europe is declining itself as a civilization, and in the West, that's not necessarily conducive or a comment that should necessarily be put in a national defense strategy. And so is this Greenland one of a multitude of issues which will continue to chip away the trust and confidence in the transatlantic alliance? Or is this something where, again, maybe this is one of the few final remaining issues that will be forgotten because we're going to have another geopolitical crisis coming up? And I'm torn in that analysis. And I would like your guys' take, because I do believe that President Trump, from the Greenland perspective, he's going to claim a win, move on, and that the next focus that we talked about last week and we'll talk about soon in a future episode, I think is going to be Iran. And I think that's going to consume a lot of the U.S. And even European capitals' attention, is going to be Iran. But Michael, I'll go to you.
Honestly, in my opinion, this is far from the last controversy we're going to see with the Trump admin. This is far from the last, major thing that's going to consume not only the media cycle, but that's going to consume like geopolitical focus. Trump is obviously going to, push whatever agenda he really wants at the time for whatever country it may be. I mean, our next crisis may be Iran. Our next crisis may be refocusing back on Ukraine and Russia. It may be back Venezuela. It may be to a country that we aren't even really thinking about right now. The Trump admin really is, jumping from back to forth, and is what was commented on earlier. Mike, I think you brought it up. Like, while the chief of staff is saying like there's going to be less foreign trips, and there's probably, that's probably a nod to that. There's going to be more focus in the Western hemisphere. Like, the United States is not fully out of its, involvement not only in the Middle East, but all around the globe. Like, and whether or not, Trump likes it, our involvement and our participation in whatever conflicts are going around there is still ongoing. And how he is going to react to that and how he is going to address that, honestly, I gotta say, is just kind of up to him. And like, what has been determined U.S. policy for a long time really kind of doesn't matter to the most part. It just falls to the whim of what Trump is wanting and what he is like aiming for the United States to be and to become. I mean, we do have to probably go off of what his campaign promises and what he is like aiming to, satisfy domestically at home as well, because there is the factor of the midterms that are going to play really heavily into how, not only, the next couple months, probably even into the end of the year but are going to, underlay how successful Trump is going to be. Whether or not he's going to be able to push his agenda at home is up to there. And, how he's, I think, going to try to fluff up his agenda at home is trying to pull in more success, abroad. However we see that becoming, or whether or not he really is going to be able to, hopefully, actually pull out of conflicts, or potentially prevent more conflicts from happening. Maybe that's the route he's hoping to see, and maybe that's the route that, their Trump admin and probably those surrounded by him are pushing him towards. And, it's up to see. In terms of Iran, that's you know, I may be eating my own words there, but, it all analysis and everything we've been looking towards points towards that something is most likely going to be going down in Iran. But how Trump is handling Greenland right now may also be indicating whether or not he's going to be changing his tune in Iran as well.
No, and I think that's the kind of the key aspect. But I think this is a good opportunity to kind of pivot to the next area of conversation that we want to cover, and that's the kind of the situation in Syria. Again, this is something that we kind of were discussing about in our space this week on Monday, and kind of the interesting scenario that we're seeing is that President al-Shara, kind of the leader of the Syrian transitional government, who took over after the fall of Bashar al-Assad, the former leader of the Foreign Terrorist Organization, HTS, now kind of been reincorporated into the West, welcomed into the United States by President Trump, and clearly the Trump administration has picked President al-Shara to be kind of the ally of the United States in the Middle East. President Shah launched an offensive against our historical allies in Syria, specifically in the counter-ISIS fights, the Syrian Democratic Forces, led by the Kurds. There has been a lot of negotiations between the SDF and the Syrian transitional government to see how the SDF can be reincorporated as part of this new Syrian state, whatever that Syrian state looks like. Is it a federal state, etc.? A lot of those details were still being hashed out. Clearly, the negotiations broke down, and Syrian transitional government forces launched an offensive in areas that the SDF not only just occupied shortly after the fall of Bashar al-Assad, but now they've taken areas that the SDF has had a presence in almost over a decade in Syria. And the Syrian transitional government is pushing the SDF out. And what the other things that we saw is that the Arab tribes that were kind of part of the Syrian Democratic Forces, a lot of them, the vast majority of them, for a multitude of reasons that we could probably go to, specifically around al-Hasaq, have announced that they're abandoning the SDF and they're joining the Syrian transitional government led by President al-Shara. And that's basically kind of spelled the end of the Syrian Democratic Forces, right? Obviously, Turkey has probably played a role in this. The Turks have been very vocal of their concerns about the Syrian Democratic Forces because of their ties, and also with the YPG and their ties with the PKK. And this idea of an autonomous, semi-autonomous, or even independent Kurdish state in Syria has always been a red line for Turkey. For years and years and years, they have been very concerned of the SDF and Kurdish expansion across the Euphrates River Valley. That has caused a lot of problems. And we've seen even Turkey launch military offensive against SDF forces, not only in Afrin, which is in northwest Syria, but in eastern Syria as well, to create a kind of this buffer area along the border. Now clearly looks like the Turks and President Erdogan have not only vocally supported, but probably gave him logistical and military, even some military support to the STG in their offensive against the Kurds. But make no mistake that the majority of the fighting, the majority of the offensive has come from Syrian military forces, right, as part of the transitional government, not through the Turks. And they've had success. And I think what we're seeing is the SDF has basically maybe not collapsed, but has been severely weakened in Syria to the point now where even the U.S., led by the Special Envoy Tom Barak, and even the coalition, the CJTFOIR, have basically said, look, our primary now counterterrorism partner in Syria is the Syrian Transitional Government, is President al-Shara, and not the Kurds of the Syrian Democratic Forces, who we relied to for over a decade for the counter-ISIS fight. And it looks like now President al-Shara will be our primary counterterrorism partner against ISIS, which raises a lot of questions and dynamics. There's a lot to discuss. I mean, this is obviously a scenario where President al-Shara might be trying to consolidate a Syrian state after the fall of Bashar al-Assad. But the problems that he's running into is a lot of the fighting that his forces have been involved in have targeted minorities, which has been a concern of President al-Shara assuming power, and the HTS kind of assuming the powers of Syria, that they were going to target minorities. We saw that against the Alawites in the Levant. Obviously, their claim is a lot of those uprisings and target operations were against pro-Assad kind of insurgent groups and remnants that were based in Levant. We saw tensions and fighting against the Druze in southeast Syria, which involved that then got Israel to be military involved and even launched airstrikes against the Syrian transitional government. Even the Syrian Ministry of Defense was specifically bombed by the IDF because of the offensive against the Druze. And now we're seeing that obviously with the Kurds. But there's a lot to discuss about the SDF, maybe from the other perspective. They didn't see the writing was on the wall. They didn't see that they were not going to be able to hold on to the Arab tribes who are wanting to obviously go with the Syrian transitional government, that maybe the Kurds and the Syrian Democratic Forces were just no longer welcome with the fall of Bashar al-Assad and kind of the defeat of ISIS in that area. So again, there's a lot to analyze. There's a lot to discuss. I threw that all out there. So Mike, let me go to you. I guess my first and immediate question to you is, do you think it was the right decision that the United States decided to abandon basically the Kurds or say they're no longer a primary counterterrorism partner and transition over to President al-Shara? Mike?
No. Like, again, this all goes back to the March 10th, 2025 agreement, right? And there was an inability of al-Shara and the SDF to come to some type of conclusion on that, right? And it was the whole idea was the integration of the SDF and encourage into a centralized Syria. The developments over the last week here have been pretty shocking. A completely right, and we'll give a specific example here. The completely disjointed effort at the ISIS prisons that the SDF have been guarding for quite some time. The Syrian forces, governmental forces, stormed in. Right, no real coordinated effort. The SDF called international partners. Sounds like they didn't pick up the phone, and then that was it. Right, and it just became a situation where the SDF accuses the Syrian transitional government of releasing, I think, prisoners. ISIS, and then the Syrian army accuses the SDF of releasing the prisoners, and it becomes a completely disjointed situation. It's been just one of those that I have to scratch my head at, is how this all kind of played out. And you know, Stefano, you were saying like the SDF didn't see the writing on the wall when it came to the Arab tribe. I don't think the SDF saw the writing on the wall that the U.S. was going to completely abandon them, considering the history that the SDF and U.S. forces have had in the counter ISIS operations. I think what the SDF was looking to get out of all this was some form of autonomy, and that's not complete autonomy, right? Clearly, al-Shara is looking to centralize control of the Syrian state in a consolidated fashion where there's no real rights respected of the minorities. He could kind of say certain things and frame the centralized government in Syria, I mean, in Damascus, on however he wants, but it's pretty evident that there was a lack of interest in any type of peaceful unification, clearly with the attacks on the SDF. There's a lot to talk about here. I'll let Michael hop in, but definitely a few other points I want to bring up.
I mean, I just got to agree with Mike. I really think that this probably isn't the best move. I mean, I think Mike has more insight on the area specifically, but from what I'm looking at it, how I see that Syria currently is broken up and divided, while the government of al-Shara is trying to centralize the state itself, it is still having to face the fact that there's several different groups within a country that are either seeking and looking for autonomy or that are openly, against the state itself. And, taking on this campaign of like fighting a former U.S. ally, one that's like for what over a decade at this point been in the news, been in under support, and constantly fighting against for its own autonomy and it you have to really consider like what I've said before about the long term and the short term implications about this, because this is not going to end any kind of conflict in the region. This isn't going to make Syria, in the short term more peaceful. In fact, I think in the short and long term, this is only going to cause more division, and this is going to cause, more trouble than what was expected.
I mean, I think the issue, though, I guess it goes back to is, I mean, what options did the United States have, right? I didn't see a universe where the United States was going to get military involved to stop President al-Shara. Clearly, I think we've seen some elements within the U.S. administration, specifically Senator Lindsey Graham, trying to reimpose the Caesars Act. I think the SDF realized, I mean, they are trying to reconsolidate in very small pockets back up in northeast Syria, probably like more closer to kind of Kobani area, but further east and all that. But with President Assad taking over, look, I understand, right? They're not necessarily the ideal counterterrorism partner for the United States. I mean, it's important to know that where was Baghdadi captured, the leader of ISIS? I mean, he was captured in kind of these territories where Turkey was operating with their Syrian rebels, right? I mean, and a lot of the strikes that the United States has conducted before the fall of Bashar al-Assad were in areas where in Idlib, where President al-Shara back then, Giuliani was based his fighters in Idlib, right? And so clearly there's a lot of problems. The attack in Palmyra and Tadmor that killed 2 American service members and 1 interpreter, we're accusing ISIS of that attack, but it was a member of the Syrian transitional government, military forces and law enforcement personnel based out of Palmyra, right? It was not necessarily an actual declared ISIS fighter. And then the United States conducted a strike against an al-Qaeda operative and somehow connected both of them there. So again, I think there's a lot of problem sets that the United States is going to run into with dealing with President al-Shara from a counterterrorism perspective. But I think he is a much more reliable partner, I would say, than at least for the rest of Syria, what we had before, which was Bashar al-Assad, right? I mean, if you're running into a situation where you're looking at Syria holistically, right, the Syrian Democratic Forces were never going to seize all of Syria. So you have to deal with the people you got. And before it was Bashar al-Assad, who was a very unreliable partner, who enabled the expansion of the Iranian threat network and Iranian proxies across Syria, and enabled the Russians to have a significant amount of presence inside of Syria. And now with President al-Shara, at least you have a committed counterterrorism partner who is willing to coordinate and fight along, and fight against ISIS. However, the problem sets that we see with their affinity and their affiliation previously with al-Qaeda, we do see that they're willing to conduct operations in coordination with the United States. They have pushed the ITN really out of Syria and kind of really reduced Iranian influence in the Levant because of that. And, the Russians, although still have a military base, have been significantly weakened and reduced, right? So I think that's the problem, that the administration just had to make a decision. And I think one of the main issues is because the Syrian Democratic Forces were not able to hold their ground on themselves. Maybe there was a situation where fighting was getting very intense and there was kind of a stalemate, similar to kind of what we saw with the Druze, where it does look like the Druze put a much more significant resistance because the areas that the Syrian transitional government was entering inside was Druze community. That was Druze territory. And the Druze have been very clear since the start of the Syrian civil war. They didn't expand their influence or their territorial control. They stayed very limited. The Syrian Democratic Forces, because of the support of the United States and because of the counter-ISIS fight, obviously, we encouraged them to expand into areas that historically did not belong to them. And they were very effective as doing that. The problem then became, though, at some point, they just not only weren't unable to fight the Syrian transitional government, but they lost the support of the Arab tribes. It was fait accompli. And would have made no sense. I just don't see the United States trying to do airstrikes to stop it, risking to lose these Arab tribes, specifically in the middle Euphrates River Valley, that we rely on to maintain our military support. And look, the United States is going to maintain its military presence in Syria for at least for the immediate future. I mean, I think the question is this a long-term objective to pull out of Syria? But at least for the immediate future, for at least the next couple of months, The U.S. is staying in Syria. The difference, though, is going to be they're going to have to be working with the Syrian transitional government, not the SDF. And I think that's a new dynamic, but that's why the United States didn't do anything. And again, an interesting point where even the U.S. was concerned about the influence of SDF inside of Syria. If you recall, when Bashar al-Assad fell, we did see the SDF cross over to the Euphrates River Valley and seize some of the territories that were on paper kind of controlled uh, by Bashar al-Assad, but which kind of caused consternations along Deir, Raqqa, etc., Abu Kamal, those areas that were under the control of the Syrian regime. We did see the Syrian Democratic Forces go over, but one of the major ones, the center of operations, not only for Bashar al-Assad but Iran and Russia, was Palmyra. And so when Bashar al-Assad collapsed, the Iranians pulled out, their militia groups pulled out, Hezbollah pulled out, and the Russians pulled out. Who was the group that went there? It wasn't the SDF, because the U.S. knew that Turkey would never allow it. It was the American-backed Syrian rebel groups from, the Arab Syrian rebel groups from Antam Garrison, who went all the way up to Palmyra, all the way up to Tadmur, and seized that, not the SDF. And those rebel groups do appear to be coordinating very well with the Syrian transitional government and have acknowledged the role of the Syrian transitional government. And those rebels have been basically American proxies for almost over a decade now. But the U.S. sent them over to seize Palmyra, not the SDF. So I think that's why the writing was on the wall. And I think because there was not major clashes and the SDF couldn't halt the advance, fait accompli in and of itself. But Mike, I'll go to you.
Yes, so a few points here. First off, I don't think there was ever a thought that the U.S. was going to military intervene and conduct airstrikes al-Shara, right? The big point was that the U.S. maintained very strong diplomatic channels, right? Yeah, al-Shara put on a nice suit and came to the White House. That was very, very, right, theatrical, very nice. But the United States maintained very strong diplomatic channels with both the SDF and al-Shara, right? What the SDF was looking for was not some complete control of Syria. Right. They were looking for local governance continuity. Right. They were looking for integration of their security forces and the military to keep some sense of identity. And clearly that's not what al-Shara is going for. I don't think anybody could argue to the opposite at this point, that he's at all welcoming to the SDF remaining any type of identity. Third point, you said al-Shara is very committed to the counter ISIS fight and the counter. That's interesting, because I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. He's very suspect at this point, and we need to recognize what his background is, right? Oh, he gave some intelligence that struck some targets in Syria. That might have had something to do with his efforts to consolidate power within HTS, right, and al-Nusra Front. And it's just a little interesting, and I think the Israelis have had a very interesting view on who al-Shara truly is and what his intentions might be in Syria. Fourth point, and this is the final one on it, and you mentioned this, about the SDF and their ability to carry out some operations in Syria, and you said something that was key, right, is that Turkey would never allow it. It's very interesting to consider Turkey in this situation and just how much of a role they've had in pressing the U.S. to make certain decisions. The U.S. seems to want to just kind of rinse their hands of Syria at this point and let it be what it is. And I think they see Turkey as being one of the ones that can kind of step into the void to help do that, right? Turkey, a NATO ally, let them control the situation. They have their interests with the PKK, and they can frame everyone as a terrorist that's Kurdish related. Turkey's going to do that. But I think it's very interesting at this point, the way Turkey's playing the very strong role in trying to paint the SDF as being a terrorist organization, period, and that the administration is coming back away from any type of argument on that.
I think there's a lot of suspicion. What I would say, though, if you're looking at it from the Israeli perspective, right, we've seen, obviously, they have had a conversation with Bashar al-Assad, and obviously they're continuing to having these conversations with President al-Shara. I mean, we are seeing the Trump administration really try to see if they can get Syria and Israel to have normalized relations and kind of at least a ceasefire or a peace treaty in place between both countries. And it does look like that one of the issues where the Trump administration was concerned about was kind of these Israeli military operations in southern Syria. It's very interesting when you're analyzing this from the Trump administration's perspective. They weren't putting the blame on President al-Shara. They were squarely putting the blame on Benjamin Netanyahu and saying, I mean, they have been blasting Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, and his operations in southern Syria, because the Trump administration viewed that as undermining this idea of trying to expand the Abraham Accords and solidify Israel's role in the Middle East and these normalization of relations. And they're saying you can't do this, right? You cannot continue this. And it looks like part of the agreement, why we've seen a significant drop, almost cessation completely, of Israeli operations in Syria that were picking up steam. It looks like there was an agreement with the Trump administration where Israel agreed, okay, we'll stop doing military offensives in southern Syria for the most part, at least airstrikes, etc. And they're focusing almost entirely on Lebanon against Hezbollah. Right. And that does look like, I mean, does look like that, at least from the Trump administration perspective, I think we're all in agreement. They've picked President al-Shara to be the guy. Love him or hate him, history or not, he's the guy. And we are having conversations, and we know that the United States is playing a mediation role between Syria, President al-Shara, and Israel. And it's actually interesting that other reporting that we're getting is that Israel didn't really have a concern or any objections to President al-Shara's offensive against the SDF. Now, is this a broader aspect where Syria is again playing this pawn, which is really within the role of the United States trying to leverage Syria with Israel and Turkey and from much more regional aspect? Possibly, very possibly. But I think the we can have our opinions and the history, and I think it's also very interesting the consolidation. But the fact that President Assad is not hiding the fact that he's having conversations with Israel. I mean, he's been very vocal about this. We have seen ISIS increase their terrorist attacks, and for now, it doesn't look like, at least internally in Syria, although there's a lot of extremist elements within this organization, and we saw those extremist elements in those terrorist organizations be very active, specifically against the Druze and their offensive there. That kind of got the involvement of the Israeli Defense Forces. We haven't really necessarily seen that, and we haven't seen an increase of threat from these organizations inside of the Syrian transitional government threatening necessarily directly Israel directly. It looked like, at least from the Trump administration perspective, it was the other way around. That Israel's actions along the borders, like across the Golan Heights, was creating this situation of increased tension and military risk that they're trying to avoid. And so again, we can ask one way or another, but President Trump clearly has picked President al-Shara. They removed the Caesar Acts and the sanction there. And President al-Shara is going to be president for the next couple of years, regardless of what next administration. The question is, do we see a continuation of counterterrorism operations directed against ISIS and al-Qaeda? Or do we run into a situation where we're replicating the Taliban in Afghanistan, which terrorist activity is still running amok there, and we don't really have any influence inside of the dynamics of Afghanistan? I do believe the U.S. has much more influence inside of Syria. We don't have influence in Afghanistan. I think the administration wants to continue that route, and the only way they can continue that route is by continuing to work with President al-Shara.
Yeah, I can make a few points on that. I mean, it's just interesting to see, right, what Turkey and Israel are doing in Syria, right? And we're talking about U.S. influence in Syria, and there might be even a deeper point here that the U.S. just doesn't want influence in Syria at this point, right? That the Trump administration is willing to take a hands-off approach and say, Turkey, Israel, you guys figure it out. Now, that's obviously a tremendous amount of issues there, right, between the Turks and the Israelis, and that their interests might clash, and we've seen, right, a lot of diplomatic spats between the two. But it remains to be seen where that goes. You talked a little bit about the Israeli negotiations with al-Shara. I mean, they've been very slow going, right? The Israelis might want to be pragmatic at this point because of some of the pressure from the Trump administration, but it certainly hasn't made like leaps and bounds, right? It's still they still view al-Shara extremely with a lot of skepticism, and they're very suspicious of his actions there. So it just remains to be seen what type of outcome will happen over the next few years there. Again, does it become, right, we're talking about, does counter ISIS and operations continue? Maybe, right? Or do they become counter Kurdish operations, right? Does Turkey encourage the government in Damascus to more focus that, on the Turkish problem, which they would identify as the Kurds, right? And say, oh, the SDF are terrorist organizations. We need to fight terrorists. That's right. Let's shift it over there, right? This is PKK, right? Don't worry about ISIS. That's been handled. But there are bigger threats on the Turkish border.
Mike, I think you really bring up a fair point there, and kind of echoing what I was saying earlier. And Stefano, I really think that no matter the route and the kind of position the United States is going to take, Syria is going to be like this, stuck in this kind of limbo state of where it still is going to have insurgents plaguing across country, whether or not the United States is assisting one side or the other. And it's going to take a lot of effort to, see Syria, brought back to a point where that's not really that much of a worry. I mean, it's in what, almost 2 decades, and that's still an issue we see across multiple countries in the Middle East and areas that the United States still has a presence within. Even if we have, various different influences in the Syrian government pushing it towards one direction or another, it's going to have to address all of these issues that it's facing right now. It may prioritize one or the other, but like we said, it's going to have to get it. It's going to have to get addressed. And I really think that, in my opinion, the bigger threat most likely wasn't the BKK, but I do think that that's probably where, unfortunately, as we see the direction of that, that's the threat that's going to be addressed first.
No, and I think that's kind of the issue, right? In Syria, even after the fall of Bashar al-Assad, continues to be in turmoil, and it continues to be, I guess, maybe a pawn, maybe no longer between geopolitical pawn in the sense of Russia, the United States, but now at least in a regional sense between Israel and Turkey, right? And I think at least from a U.S. perspective, I mean, I remember having these conversations when we were talking about Syria way back in even our podcasts when before kind of even the fall of Bashar al-Assad when it started to break. I mean, my whole argument is that from the U.S. perspective, we made it abundantly clear for years now that the only thing we care about is counter ISIS operations. That's it. There is literally no other major interest in that. And then the second was trying to, at best possible, limit Iranian influence inside of Syria, specifically in the areas we controlled. But the areas that Bashar al-Assad controlled, Iran and their proxies ran amok, and the only one who was trying to at least target them was the Israelis. The interesting aspect is with the fall of Bashar al-Assad, I mean, Iran has lost Syria. I mean, and we talked about this in kind of the spaces in the podcast, right? The Iranians' perspective of Syria being their 34th province that they lost, and now the fall of Tehran and the Islamic Republic might be imminent because of this, right? And then it's kind of interesting that that's the situation we're seeing ourselves. But after that, I mean, from a U.S. perspective, from the Trump perspective, it's like, yeah, well, we just want to make sure we have a counter ISIS fight wherever it might be, and maybe with limited military forces inside of Syria, just some within the Middle East, looking at Jordan, like MSAB air base, right? That's a key military installation, a military air base that we can leverage for strikes inside of Syria. Maybe some soft within the region. They can do targeted raids or operations in coordinations with the Syrian government. And maybe a lot of the focus will be shifted away from eastern Syria to other places within Syria. Do we see an expansion, let's say, within the Syrian military command in Damascus? Do we see on-top garrisons still play a role within the counter-ISIS fight? I mean, I think that's the key aspect that just because we're seeing this collapse of the Kurds, and now the Syrian transitional government and President al-Shar is continuing to solidify himself as the primary actor in Syria, like it or not, and with the current sentiments that we have, I think the United States is moving along with that direction, and it would be interesting to see how that continues, right? Russia clearly lost a major influence with Bashar al-Assad. Iran has lost all influence that they have. The United States clearly now has positioned itself with Turkey maybe as the primary partner of President al-Shara. And maybe this is an area where Trump and Erdogan are trying to have those conversations where Erdogan wants more against PKK and maybe Trump wants more PKK and or SDF at this point. For the Turks, they view them as the same, even though they're not. And Trump maybe wants more normalization of relations with Israel. And maybe that's kind of this grand compromise that's been there. But again, that's the problem, is that Syria will continue to have kind of instability and violence. And it would be interesting to see once the dust settles. Clearly, Tom Barak, the U.S. Special Envoy for Syria, who's also the U.S. Ambassador for Turkey, is continuing a lot of these discussions. We've seen President Macron of France have conversations with the Iraqi Kurdistan government about the situation. The KRG in Iraq has also tried to be involved. And I think there is a way that maybe the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Syrian Kurds have a reduced presence in some of the areas. It would be, as Mike, you alluded to, is what does that look like? And is this an area where Syria is just going to be a national government, a centralized government, not even remotely possible for federal division of power, similar to what we might see in the United States? Is this more like a France centralized government? That looks like what's going on. We'll see how that plays with the minorities, such as the Alawites, the Kurds, or the Druze, and we'll see if the United States decides to get involved to kind of push Syria in a different direction, or are they just going to prioritize the Abraham Accords with Israel? But that's all we have for today. I want to thank Mike and Michael for joining me in this latest round of the podcast. We had a great conversation about Greenland with kind of the breaking news. We'll definitely keep an eye on that. We had another very in-depth conversation about the situation in Syria. We are obviously, as we said multiple times in this episode, we are keeping an eye on Iran, the deployment of military forces there, and some of the reporting indicating that Trump not only might have decided a military course of action against Iran, but might go to the most extreme course of action, which is regime change. Again, a lot of this is unconfirmed. A lot of this is really unknown, and we won't know until something actually happens on the ground. But we will definitely keep an eye on it. We will continue to have these conversations on our X Spaces and on this podcast. But until then, thank you so much for joining us. This has been in the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast.